Okay, so colleagues, we might start. I'm sure there'll be a few people coming in as we go. So delighted to kick off 2016. This is the first seminar for the Menzies Centre for Health Policy. I'm Sharon Friel, I'm the Director of the Menzies Centre for Health Policy. For those of you who don't know it, it's a collaboration between the ANU and Sydney University, and here within the ANU we're a collaboration across the whole campus, so the Research School of Population Health, the Regulatory School of Regulation and Global Governance, RegNet, the Crawford School of Public Policy, and I hope soon to be the Centre for Health Stewardship. And really what the purpose of the Menzies Centre is all about is to raise awareness, bring evidence to bear around some of the key health policy issues of our time. And it's fantastic to have Art to kick off today. It's an area that we've not spoken about before within the Menzies Centre, so no pressure, Art, to get us up to speed. Let me introduce. I'm not going to read out Art's full bio. It is phenomenal, and I'm literally just going to say so. Professor Art
Sedrakyan. It's okay, close.
I've been practicing.
I get that misspelled like 50 different ways, so I'm used to it.
So Art joined the Research School of Population Health really just towards the end of last year, and is the foundational chair in Health Services Research and Policy, which is a lovely broad spectrum of activities here within the school. He brings this wealth of evidence of sort of clinical oriented research that is entirely policy relevant, and delighted to see colleagues in the room so we've got colleagues here from the Department of Health, from the AMA, I think from TGA as well. So obviously the topic speaking very closely to health policy here in Australia, so delighted for colleagues to join. Really sorry about the disaster of parking on the ANU. It's outrageous. So Art is going to speak to us for about 30-40 minutes.
Yeah, I'll keep it short.
And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And as I say, it's the start of, I hope, what will be a very prominent area within the work of the Menzies Centre for Health Policy. So Art's going to raise issues that we can keep coming back to over the course of the year. So yeah,
I hope so. I mean, to lower your expectations a little bit, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just to lower your expectations a little bit, I've never given this talk before. It's brand new. All the examples I'm talking about are relatively kind of published this past year. This is not one of those, talks that, commercial talks. So if anything comes up in terms of not well polished, please help me. I'll improve after this talk, hopefully today. But I thought this is the right time to bring up this issue of how regulators can be helpful and how we can also rely on what they do to advance health services research agenda. So conceptually, here is the, I hope this works. Let's see. Heavy slides, or something is wrong with it. Oh, maybe page down works? Oh, that way. So devices certainly become more and more important in the past decade. We've been exposed to many high-profile failure cases that were important for public health. So it started off with metal-on-metal implant failure that, in fact, Australia, an Australian data system, which is Orthopedic Registry, reported first back in 2008, and Australian government acted on it quite quickly, while it took another 5-6 years before other countries kind of acted on that evidence. So hundreds of thousands of people were exposed to some faulty hip implants, and consequences were substantial for public health and costs, right? So, but the point is that we recognize more importance of devices in our today's life because of technology evolution and improvements that are happening in the past, decade or so, right? These days, we've got tons of apps on our iPhones or any other devices you use that are considered to be medical device because they allow many of these products to apply in a healthcare setting, measure things that we're used to measure even using sophisticated products before. I depicted some of them here on this slide. It's evolving. If you look up what, say, a lot of these venture capitalists are investing in, it's more often are devices because they think it's kind of has a potential to be adopted faster. Also because of the problems in terms of adoption and approval of medical devices, which is a different question. So I'm going to give you some US numbers, but the expenditures on medical devices are over $150 billion in the United States. Again, I don't have Australian numbers, but it's over 6% of the health expenditures in the United States. It's a huge number. And over 1 million annually now, I checked back like a month ago, annually over 1 million adverse event reports are submitted to U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It used to be 20% of drugs, now it's equal. So as many safety events are reported to a U.S. regulator as for drugs, and it's growing way faster than for drugs. Also certainly related to the way the medical community and patients start paying attention to these issues. I must admit, because devices, and particularly implantable products, have been done by interventionalists, surgeons, interventional radiologists, interventional cardiologists, these are not the people who do a lot of the public health research. They're much more clinical, and these kind of issues were kind of embedded in some of the clinical investigations, but they're not going out into public health community, health services research community, health policy community, because the docs, even like who are working in our environment, they're mostly trained in family medicine, internal medicine, prevention. So we were not really noticing this epidemic of medical device problems that was going to happen sooner or later. So a few numbers there as well. There are many recalls these days. The most recent data I had was 2012, and it was about 1,200 recalls. The harms related to medical devices that I talked about, these metal hips, mesh filters that I will be talking about today. Interestingly, a lot of these IV pumps have had a lot of problems, and it's huge number of adverse events reported to IV pumps. So the major challenge is that we don't have in any healthcare databases the unique identification for a product. It makes it harder for us to study, but it doesn't mean we cannot study. We just will be limited often to the class level effects or particular kind of larger level of analysis of these devices. So this one, I think one of my colleagues sent internally. So the Minister of Health targeting 800 million medical device waste. So I think it's getting the attention it deserves. I think we definitely need to do more work and better understand the safety and effectiveness and waste. So the focus would be on mostly post-market safety communications that regulators issue. And a few examples, like two examples I'll talk about. I'll talk about another example where there's not yet a safety communication, but in my opinion should be, and something we need to pay attention to. So TGA often sends these safety alerts. Similarly, FDA has the safety communications, and in UK, MHRA is issuing medical device alerts. So there are these recalls also one can look into, kind of what has been recalled and whether that can have a reflection of entire class of products. Post-approval study request is often what U.S. Food and Drug Administration issues, and they ask companies to do additional studies when they have a concern about a particular device. It will involve new data collection. Warning letters, if they're not compliant, is another tool that are used. And 522 studies, these are surveillance studies. The definition of 522 versus post-approval study request is post-approval study is mostly embedded with the clinical study that a company has already done for approval. So they ask them to continue additional data collection, while 522 studies would be completely new data that needs to be collected and added. Now, the importance of them is really if they issue these communications or these requests, that means something is wrong with the product or maybe class of products, so it offers us opportunity to study them better or give us ideas on what to study. So here is 3 examples that I have here. Upper left corner is the FDA communication on metal on metal hips. On the right side on the top is the MHRA that issued this similar communication. And this is most recent from TGA about Birmingham hip, modular head. I suspect this is still kind of maybe a metal on metal, but maybe other different classes as well would fit in that category. So, but I'm going to talk about this one today to start with. Pelvic organ prolapse is relatively common condition, and it has different levels of severity and different kind of organ-related organs that unfortunately are affected in this situation. The right side is often given by my friends urologists who are way better at making a joke out of it. It's supposed to be a joke. So the way you can treat it is inversion. So obviously you can't. So the surgical approach is really the oldest and most well-known approach is this plication. So it was introduced for incontinence, but became kind of later on a basis for cystocellular repair, one of the ways the pelvic organ prolapse will occur. It's really approximation of this fascia so that it can be, the wall can be strengthened and prevent this from occurring again. So later on, there were these mesh products and approaches that have been developed. So various types that were used in starting from 1955, but so-called revolution came with this polypropylene mesh depicted here. And it has been used quite widely internationally, and I think it's still being used quite widely. While in 2008, FDA came up and issued first safety communication about it. It was interesting what FDA said is that there are some risks and you should obtain training on how to do this best. And there wasn't much about it, but there were some summary of events that occurred and were reported to FDA. In 2011, though, they had much stronger communication about various harms. So I'll talk about this later. Lawyers get involved anytime there is a safety communication. So it's really good business for them. You can see on the TV everywhere, like they're trying to recruit patients. Certainly we'll talk to them. That one on the top is interesting. Time heals all wounds, but money can help too. So it's like interesting how they kind of like really interesting ways of getting people to talk to them. So this is our study. I'm going to talk about the study that we did first to look at the effectiveness of mesh. And we used the entire state's data in New York to look if mesh compared to not using mesh was associated with higher rate of reoperations. Now, reoperations might not be related to the failure of the procedure. We believe are mostly related to the problems with mesh. So it's kind of separates slightly from failure of the procedure itself. What we found is that mesh-based therapy led to higher rate of reintervention within 1 year follow-up. That's the red circle in the bottom. And also for urinary incontinence. So importantly, there was an age-specific effect. The reintervention occurrence was way stronger in younger women, while urinary retention was mostly affecting elderly women. So under 65 versus over 65 mattered. So this is the key, though, for our discussion today. When we looked at the data back in 2011, that we had only the up until 2011 data for this BMJ study, we saw that after 2008 FDA communication, the mesh use continued to grow. So up until 2011, the use was growing, while after 2011, this is depicted here, it's a second paper in JAMA Internal Medicine, we saw a substantial reduction in use of mesh. It was quite interesting. I do believe the communication in 2011, when they had much stronger language in it, and they also talked about internal systematic review to look at the harms. They also had patient-specific communication and physician-specific communication. All that, in my opinion, mattered. And they also talked about alternatives to mesh. So what else could have changed? I only linked to this strong language of 2011. What else could have suddenly changed the physician's approach or aspects of it? So this is another data about that discontinuation of use. What we found that low-volume institutions were more likely to stop using it, and non-teaching hospitals were more likely to discontinue using it. So in fact, this is an evidence that many academic hospitals wouldn't like in the United States. I never kind of highlighted it because there's this trend towards show me the value and academic centers do better. So for this example of discontinuation of problematic technology, we've seen the opposite effect. In fact, the lower volume hospitals, non-teaching, were more likely to discontinue. Why? I think it might be related to opinionated clinicians, high volume, who know how to use best in their opinion, or what the effect is, or maybe they're right. We don't know yet. But also I believe it's a risk of litigation. Smaller practice, non-teaching hospitals, they don't have as many lawyers to fight, so they would more likely maybe to discontinue using it and go alternative, or in fact lower their volume of these procedures to start with. So it's an interesting observation how regulatory communication gives us an idea of what to study, how to study, which issues to look at. So some conclusions, well, I already talked about them pretty much, that 2011 stronger language had an impact. I'm getting close to my allocated time, but this is one case when we don't have the regulatory warnings yet. But it's a technology that I think worth paying attention to. I think there are a number of safety events already reported related to this technology. It's about clipping or coiling un-ruptured intracranial aneurysms. We looked at this for elderly patients over 65 for about 11 years of data, US Medicare data. So the background on un-ruptured aneurysms, it affects about 3% of the general population. If it ruptures, it leads to subarachnoid hemorrhage. Mortality for this devastating condition is between 30 to 45%. So it's something you do want to prevent. And then permanent disability, another 20%. Now the preventive therapy is really this clipping or coiling. here's what it means. On the left is coiling. So with a catheter, you put a coil inside that so it's blocked and it will no longer kind of bleed. And clipping means surgery, open surgery. To cut this, make an incision on the skull and get to that aneurysm and then clip it. So obviously coiling is less invasive, while clipping is much more invasive. So these are both risky. They have risk associated with them. So we must sure we're balancing against the risk of the hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage occurrence. Now, this is important. Annual rupture risk is very low. So that's important, right, in terms of paying attention and thinking about higher risk groups, where to implant this more. About 50 to 80%, I think it's, unfortunately, literature is not very consistent, they do not rupture. So here's our study. The blue is clipping. It stayed constant over the years. The red is coiling. It had quadrupled over time, if not more. And most of the growth is due to coiling. So once you come up with something less invasive, like that kind of device-based technology, the use is always going to go up, and they possibly will use this technology on a low-risk patients and aneurysms that maybe don't need anything to do. So we looked at what happened to the safety of these procedures. So over time, we found fewer mortality, fewer complications, fewer people would die for both technologies. But overall, certainly coiling is relatively safer. So it is associated with lower mortality overall, lower risk of complications. So the bottom is coiling, the top is clipping. But this is kind of what, again, this important observation. What they were supposed to do is to reduce subarachnoid hemorrhage, and that's not happening again. So with the growth of clipping and coiling, the hemorrhaging is not going down. In fact, it's increasing in recent years. So again, a phenomenon of technology that we use that, again, in my opinion, is of low value. Increasing use is not only reducing what it's supposed to do, but it's increasing its occurrence. So these are the kind of issues that I thought, like 3 examples I will talk about today and see up for a discussion. If you agree with my line of thinking, if you see the same thing I see, or maybe something I'm missing. Stopping right there. And go back to any slide you'd like to question.
Art, really fascinating. I mean, you're posing some very significant regulatory challenges for us within Australia. It's not an area that I know, that work, but I'd love to hear your thoughts of what this really means in Australia, and likewise for colleagues. So, open the floor. Thoughts, comments, questions?
I think what I really love about it is the way that you've brought lots of different kinds of data together and put it in the regulatory environment, and that's just fantastic. So one of the questions I have is, for a couple of them, you've looked at the secular trend and then said, well, this device hasn't prevented it. But obviously, as David said, there's lots of other factors that are influencing that. And I just wonder if you've got any examples of devices where it has affected, clearly, the secular trend in a particular outcome.
So unfortunately, how will we determine that, Emily? So let's think methodologically, right? The secular trends are always tough sell because always the reviewer comments are that, what if something else happens? What if something else is involved? And I think my only response to that is, let's come up with hypotheses and let's test them. Now we have the observation. We put forward these hypotheses that IVC filter, in my opinion, creates more problems and potential for higher rates of PE than we thought is preventing it, because if you leave them for long enough, it starts kind of creating troubles rather than helping out. In fact, there's some clinical data which says you have to retrieve it, and none of them takes them out. FDA says take it out after a year or a few months or after surgery, but it's for what the interventionists do. I'm not blaming them. Okay, just I'm a surgeon by training, by the way. I mean, anyone can tell me one can say I'm guilty myself. No, but interventional medical people, a lot of radiologists, interventional cardiologists, love the prospect of putting device in. They don't like to mess with it and take it out. So they like to put it in. They'll bill for it. Taking out, not as much. It's too much trouble for little pay. So again, I'm being a little cynical, but...
So you're saying that you don't have examples where you can directly link the secular trend to a device. I think we've got an example with hormone replacement therapy in breast cancer in Australia, but it is difficult. Then I think there's a bit of a difficulty with the counterfactual, which you were saying, because there's no change, that the device isn't working.
So what I'm trying to say is, let's come up with those other trends that could affect this. For PE prevention, what else we do that could raise the rates of PE, not the IVC filter, or would have impact in terms of why this IVC filter didn't have the effect we thought it should have on a population level. So if you come up with a hypothesis of, look, there's something else going on that keeps this PE rates going or flat, that is not related to this widespread IVC filter, or that IVC filter is useless, in my opinion it's useless, I am willing to study it. I just couldn't come up. I asked lots of people, they just couldn't come up with one. Well, some people said, one of them said, oh, maybe we're detecting PEs that are not as significant. That was the only one I bought that is possible, that we're using more of those scans that helps us to detect these P's in the recent years. But then that flattening doesn't help me explain again. So it's quite interesting, but I can't say it's definitive. I'm looking for other explanations, and we're running out of options with clinicians to explain them.
So you might have to,
Particularly also for the clipping and coiling question, definitely running out of option because it's very specific, subarachnoid hemorrhage, and related to what you do to prevent it. That's even more specific.
In regard to vaginal prolapse, the standard operation was developed in Manchester, or it must have been about the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. It worked very well, and there are hundreds, thousands of publications which show it as being effective. The introduction of mesh clearly came without, to my knowledge, a careful preparation and training in the process. And I'd rather think it was popular for some reason, and suddenly many people were using it with the problems that you've described.
I agree with you.
Aware of a development of this mesh proposal or method carefully, for other new inventions have been introduced after careful and examined tests and studies.
So I know FDA now upgraded this to class 3, which means you need to do clinical trial to get another mesh approved. So it's something that got there. Now, I agree with you in terms of it has been around. It's a good technique. Urologists like them. Urologists like the mesh. They believe the results clinically might be better. No strong evidence, to be honest, but they still believe that. I personally feel like this is one of those technologies, like uncemented hips. I'll talk about it later. It makes surgeons' life easy to have a material right there, suture it up, close it up, quick buck, out, instead of mobilizing the fascia, connecting them. It doesn't work harder, longer procedure. So I feel like it's possible linking to make surgeons' life easy. And the same was for uncemented hips. When the technology came up, hip and knees, it was widely, quickly adopted without any data. Now we know from countries that kept using cement in using the hip replacement, the outcomes are way better. And head-to-head comparison of cement versus uncement, cement is better, but most doctors lost the skill of working with the cement because it came so quickly. You can just put it in, close it up, do 6 procedures a day. The next hospital where I used to, like a large hospital in New York, they do, like, doctors do 6-8 surgeries a day, each of them $15,000, versus they could do just 2 with cement. I don't know how many they could do. But it's certainly a money maker to have on-cemented technology.
I suppose I don't quite have this view of things that you're comparing mesh and no mesh, or different types of meshes, or a coil, or an incision. I think surely what we're trying to do is providing physicians with a range of options that they need to
choose carefully
for better targeting patients. The cement and no cement, for instance, as well. Cemented hips work very, very well, and in fact require a great deal of skill to put in. But if the patient's underlying bone is not good, then that a cementless hip is not for them.
Absolutely.
And so when choosing between these technologies, you're actually trading risks. And it's not correct, I think, forgive me, to sort of choose one outcome and say, well, this device did not prevent this outcome, and therefore it's a bad device. It was for this range of patients. Maybe you didn't have a choice except to use mesh, although I know that mesh is a kind of special case. Or for this group of patients, cement would have been really good because you have better options at time of revision on a young patient, and they will need a revision. A young patient will need a revision.
Absolutely.
And that sort of thing. So I think the analysis needs to take into account the complexity of where these devices are going to, and I think that both physicians and companies and regulators need to be providing a menu of choices to clinicians to better tailor therapies.
I agree with you, Dr. Garcia, right?
Yes, thank you.
we met before. I very much appreciate your comment. In fact, we do need to have options. We do need innovation, and I think the regulators' approach to it right. But unfortunately, what happens in healthcare is out of their control. Unfortunately, what happens in healthcare are driven by market forces, and the truth has boundaries, and people can work within those boundaries. And sometimes, if you go too much, in my opinion, to the right, it might result in not benefit, but in fact population level harm rather than good. And I think the cemented technology is possibly one of those cases, because there's no reason for this technology to be used on over 75 population, right? I mean, these are people with weaker bones, and yet the use in over 75 population is the same as under 65, under 55. So unfortunately, with all good intentions, the market forces drive how technology is picked up, and that's our work, health services researchers, to reveal that and question it. And I think what regulators do after that absolutely is driven by their limits. I work with FDA, as you know, very closely. So they choose or not choose to act on evidence we generate. But if we do our job, at least with the limits of the data we have, we try to find these problems or possible problems. Now, unfortunately, there's no more detailed data we can get. Mesh, for example, is often done outpatient surgery. There's very few data sets out there that allow us to look at outpatient surgery, right? I hope, in fact, we'll look at it with Australian data. I'm very excited about that. But in US, it's very limited. Like pretty much our group in New York used to do the only investigations on outpatient devices because everyone is using just Medicare data, over 65 population only. You can't look at the younger population, and mesh is used mostly in younger women where there's no data. So another technology example like that where we had to use only what we have is that contraception device issue, highly political issue. So I'm proud to say we're the only group that found a safety problem with this device, but heavily criticized by companies who believe that it's inappropriate use, or in fact it's a tolerable risk to take. So we have a very strong conclusions. Conclusions are something we always have like variations out, right? So our academic approach might be different than manufacturer approach in terms of how strong we want to have the conclusions to be. Because honestly, if we have very neutral conclusions, nobody acts on them. We want to be controversial sometimes so the news media picks it up. I know, it's reality, right? I mean, if I'm neutral approach, no one likes it. Oh no, doctor, do you think this is really shocking? I say, yes, it's shocking. You know. Please.
Tony Gill from 2GA. I think the interesting one I find in the device space, more so in the medicine space, is the three factors involved with the devices, especially in plumbing. There's obviously the choice of patient, there's the surgeon, and then there's the device.
Absolutely.
And in fact, you can have a perfect device if neither of the other two are done properly.
You're still going to get it wrong, yeah.
Around. And I think the real dilemma is how much you can work on what might appear to be a perfect or imperfect device, when in fact, what is the real one and how much you can regulate that. Because obviously, as a regulator, we can regulate the product. We have no control over the patient selection, whether the surgeon's appropriately trained, and how you can pick that up in some of those. Because when you do sort of a global figure like some of yours, it can sometimes make things look better or worse than they actually are because of those other two factors, which probably, certainly in the Eurogynae one, when they've certainly got a significant thing about 3 years ago.
Sure.
The Eurogynae part society really came out and emphasised those first two bits and choosing what you do. So I think that's the dilemma, I think, in the public health research with some of these, is how you can then tease out what might look like a global effect, what the real effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I just want to say that clinicians are great partners in this. No health services research can be good in isolation. Absolutely no. It has to be embedded with close and agreement and buy-in for a sizable portion of the clinical opinion leadership. Otherwise, we will not succeed. Because surgical approach, I think, the training matters, absolutely matters. Choice of patients, critical. And industry often blames doctors. You know, the spiel. They just want to say the docs are the problem. We gave them a perfect device. They misused it. I say it's a package deal. If they misused it on a wrong patient, you didn't have a responsible system in place to train them, which is your responsibility from a public health perspective. Whose responsibility at the end is? Either society, right, or the company, or both of them. If both of them didn't do their job, then in my opinion, it's a package deal. We can't say it's just a device. At that point in time, from health services like evidence perspective, I would say it's a package deal. If you do your job and doctors still doing a bad job selecting patients and they're not good at them, and you're training them well and they just can't do it, you know, which would be crazy, but then I would say yes, it's a different situation. But I totally agree with you.
Thanks, Art. I think one of the other contrasts between devices and medicines is the fact that if they're implantable, the person's left with them, even if you've...
you can't recall that.
Yeah, you can't recall. and
hard to recall that.
You've noted is the proportion of new procedures that happens after the safety warning. But there's loads of other people walking around with those devices still in. And we know from the breast implants issue, where there was concerns about rupture, it was impossible to identify the people who actually had the devices in.
That's true.
To actually then say to them, you should consider doing something about it. So if you imagine having that about a car part. If some car manufacturer found that it was a part that was defective, and then they said, oh, actually, we just can't even identify which cars have gone to, we can't issue them. I mean, can you imagine what people would do? And yet these devices are being implanted into people, and we can't track who has which particular kind.
I absolutely agree. Like the UDI, we need in some form. No, we have to be careful, though. This is kind of key issue comes up, Emily. I'm sorry I interrupted your flow of your thinking, but I really like this topic a lot. And U.S. payers didn't want to put it in claims, and they justified by the amount of work they have to do because it's so much work. The problem is that we in health services research community, we didn't do a good job also telling them which devices, because blood gases, anesthesia gases are a medical device. If you start getting into different proportion of mixed oxygen and nitrogen things, you end up with just anesthesia alone with hundreds of devices. You don't want that in any claims, do you? I don't want that. But we didn't tell them what are the top 100 products. Or in fact, we should have worked with regulators, and we should do this now. What are the top 100 products we want claims to include on, right? We can't just ask for every, you did a tongue, whatever depressor, put that in. It's like the form would be unmanageable.
So it has to be known. Can I add to that? Because I think what is interesting is bearing that in mind, the actual regulatory requirements for proving efficacy and safety seem to be lower for medical devices, and yet these are things that are in people that you've then got to get out of the problem. So I think that there's an overall more sort of systems level problem, that the bar is set lower for medical devices, and we actually could consider that perhaps the bar should be set higher.
So that's the problem will create enormous backlash politically. You know why? 80% of medical device companies have less than 7 employees. They're all venture capital driven. Tons of Wall Street people are betting on them, and they're more powerful than you and me. So these guys will go to any government and win on hindering innovation. So threshold raising is unfortunately is going to be hard political sell. But at least post-market surveillance, in my opinion, is something we can work together on with regulators and payers to have better data on. At least we can hopefully prevent some of these things early on. Again, this is personal opinion. Rita Redberg from Internal Medicine, she's the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine, thinks that, no, we need clinical trials for everything and we need to raise the threshold. And she's right for cardiology products. She always has in mind that I have in mind way more than cardiology products. And I feel like it's going to be, unfortunately, impossible fight. It would be very different unless we change the culture and have a moratorium on new devices for a while. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen for now. We get more devices approved in the past couple of years than way before. It's growing number. It's not stabilizing. It's like really growing.
And people wanted them.
People wanted them, absolutely. They want new gadget. Doctors want new. Of course, companies also approach to this, like the cars, different colors and different. Unfortunately, it's not the case, So every modification potentially might have a health consequences, right? Health impact. But they treat that as if it's another color of the car they're adding, instead of thinking of it as potential for harm, right?
I think it's important too that we are dealing with small risks on a numerical basis. So to address, in many cases, even when the device is said to be catastrophically wrong, the vast majority of people who receive one are receiving good therapy for them. But the incidence of occurrence of a particular problem is too high to tolerate. So you don't want to use it in another person. On the other hand, you don't want to go in and remove it from the people
right.
the device is working on. That's a real challenge, right? Especially with an issue like the PIP issue, where you couldn't really find
or the leads
did something wrong. No doubt about it. They should not have done what they did, but we threw every test that we could possibly test on that device, and
it passed.
Any other.
Interesting.
So you don't want to go in and identifying patients and tell them you have to have that implant out. In fact, we did quite the opposite. We said, please.
don't harm more by taking them out, right?
And yeah, that's a real challenge. And if you wanted a really good case study for this scenario, metal on metal, right? Metal on metal implants are really good at doing what they said they would do, which is stop pain associated with arthritis, right? And reduce the rate of dislocation. And the amount of wear is really, really low.
Mm-hmm.
But if the surgeon doesn't get that hip in perfectly right, it'll rot your hip. And the incidence of that sort of thing, the incidence is too high a price to pay for the therapy that most people are receiving from that implant. The road toll, if you like, is too high a price. So we're talking about population risks here, not personal.
Absolutely. But I also agree with metal on metal. It was a lot of these things. I met with the reporter in New York Times with multiple times, Barry Meyer, who wrote like those articles in New York Times on harms, which had huge impact. And one of the thoughts I had was, in fact, what he wrote led to so much awareness and panic that patients went back to doctors demanding it to be removed. Another problem, what I believe happened, is rewards from lawsuits, possibly also related to going back and asking them to remove. Because sometimes these rewards were in excess of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm not saying people took the risk of, doing me another surgery, take it out to get that reward, but the fact is, taking them out, this metal on metal thing had quite a bit of an interesting, mixture of problems. Now, I don't know what we can study in that context and what should we say, because I don't want to be the one who would say it was inappropriately removed. So it would be hard to say that because we can't, but we'd love to study that, collaborate with you to see which data in Australia we can identify that can help me get the metal on metal, other than the joint registry. And they might not, I don't know, hopefully they'll be interested to work with us. Joint registry runs its own course, but I would love to work with them on that question. But in claims, unfortunately, we don't have metal on metal identified. I tried out with US data, the code is there, it's filled less than 20% of the time.
It's interesting that Australia's being a small place, population-wise, there are challenges there, but I think our data gathering is much better. So,
if we can get access to it.
100%, we can contribute to the world.
Absolutely. If we can get access to it, this is something that we're going to fight here hard. Everyone is compartmentalizing their data access. And, all the different universities have different level of access suddenly and have different deals. So I want to understand more what we can do to make sure kind of have equitable access to data for folks who are enthusiastic and want to study. So that would be great for us to achieve here at ANU, in fact. We do need big data here.
Art, I think I'm going to bring it to a close.
Sure.
That will take us into a whole other discussion, which is also, of course, very important. So clearly, I had no idea it was such a big topic, but clearly raising some very important questions for health services research and for the regulatory world. I invite colleagues who are in the audience. Our next session for the Menzies Centre for Health Policy, which I can't remember when it is, but anyway, it's over in about a month's time, which is over in RegNet, so the School of Regulation and Global Governance. And really is another opportunity to bring together, it won't be on this specific topic, it'll be something to do with health systems broadly, but another opportunity for colleagues who are interested in this sort of regulatory discussion, we can keep going with that. So Art, thank you very much. A fantastic opening session for the year.
Thank you.